Castlevania Lords of Shadow is the darkest entry in Castlevania history and presents the backstory of Dracula. It's one of the few entries to receive an M for mature rating, with brutal takedowns, gory fights, and nudity. With sales for the long-running game series declining over time, Konami, the intellectual property holders for Castlevania, wanted to reboot the franchise with hopes of reinvigorating sales. With Hideo Kojima attached to the game as a producer, Lords of Shadow succeeded as a complete break from the lore and gameplay of the series past, all while becoming the best-selling entry in the franchise. Although this marked a new beginning for Castlevania, Lords of Shadow retains a Belmont as the main playable character. Here we have Gabriel Belmont, a warrior from the Brotherhood of Light who treads a dark path in the name of vengeance. In this universe, Gabriel is the first to don the Belmont surname, and is assumed to be a bastard abandoned on the Brotherhood of Light's doorstep. Gabriel's motivation to butcher everything in his path isn't complex. It's revenge, as he believes the evil of the world caused the death of his beloved wife Marie. The setup and the gameplay of Lords of Shadow should seem familiar. Can you think of another angry, brooding warrior wreaking havoc in the name of his lost family? Yeah, it's Kratos, and Lords of Shadow clearly draws from the God of War series when it comes to story, presentation, and combat design. God of War clones weren't uncommon during the 7th console generation. Look at Dante's Inferno, which is inspired by a much older literary work, but still, here we have an angry, brooding man fighting hellish forces in the name of love, with combat and quick-time events that look just like God of War. Gabriel's weapon, the Combat Cross, does keep some of that Castlevania DNA and manages to feel like a fusion of Kratos' Blades of Chaos and the whips from the series past. God of War isn't the only game Lords of Shadow draws from, as there's also systems here that are lifted right from the Devil May Cry series. It's ironic the game was so heavily influenced by God of War and Devil May Cry, as it's hard to find a more influential series than Castlevania when it comes to game design. Today, the term Metroidvania is often thrown around. Hell, it's even a tag on Steam. Like the Soulsborne and roguelike nomenclature, Metroidvanias are games whose design is derived from elements of the Metroid and Castlevania series. The only developer that has worked on both Metroid and Castlevania games is Mercury Steam, the same studio that made Castlevania Lords of Shadow. Mercury Steam is a Spanish studio with 2 Metroid titles and 3 Castlevania titles under their belt. However, their only Castlevania game that really falls into the Metroidvania subgenre is Lords of Shadow's follow-up, Mirror of Fate. Lords of Shadow doesn't ditch all design aspects of its ancestors, as it retains key ideas like revisiting previously inaccessible areas with new equipment. As a reboot of the series, Lords of Shadow begins a new universe that spans 3 games in total. Our protagonist, Gabriel Belmont, is an original character, but the latter 2 games saw reimaginations of Alucard, Trevor Belmont, and Simon Belmont. Vampires are a primary focus in older Castlevania titles, but in this iteration they play a smaller role overall. Dracula doesn't even appear in the game till the post-credits sequence. Other legacy enemies are also reinvented here, with Cornell, Carmilla, and Death taking the roles of the 3 titular Lords of Shadow. The game also uses other famous fictional creatures as supporting characters and enemies. At the beginning of his adventure, Gabriel is sent by the Brotherhood of Light to seek the spirit of his recently deceased wife, Marie. The world is careening further and further towards darkness, and the general populace fears God has abandoned them as a test of their faith. The Brotherhood of Light is privy to knowledge from their founders in heaven that Earth has been cut off from their influence due to a dark spell. Because of this severed connection, spirits are trapped on the physical plane, allowing Gabriel to visit his wife's spirit at Oblivion Lake. Marie holds vital information that could restore Heaven's connection to Earth. Even during Gabriel's initial travels, he's clearly plagued by nightmares and wrestles with his inner demons. As the journey continues, he only falls further and further into darkness. Before Gabriel is allowed to visit Oblivion Lake, Pan, an old god and the guardian of the lake, tests him. The trial foreshadows that Gabriel is in fact guilty of his wife's murder, which shakes him to the core. It's difficult for him to accept this reality, and with Pan's blessing, he faces the Titan of the lake before finally speaking with his wife. With only a moment to speak to Marie, she reveals that the founders of the Brotherhood imparted knowledge regarding a prophecy, which the powers of the Lords of Shadow are the key to unlocking. As Marie fades, Zobek, another Brotherhood warrior, speaks with Gabriel regarding this prophecy. Zobek is voiced by Patrick Stewart, and I didn't trust this guy from the moment I laid eyes on him. He's a narrator for each chapter's opening, which exposes his keen interest in Gabriel's journey and inner struggles. Zobek entices Gabriel to slay the Lords of Shadow and realize the prophecy, as it said the warrior that fulfills it will become supremely powerful, enabling them to do anything, like bringing back Marie from the dead. This comes across just like Palpatine coercing Anakin in Star Wars Episode 3 regarding powers that can control life and death itself. Now with a clear goal in sight, Gabriel sets off on his quest to kill all Lords of Shadow. From here the game takes a formulaic structure. First, players will visit the Lord of the Lycans, followed by the Lord of the Vampires, and finally ending the journey with the Lord of the Necromancers. The journey to each Dark Lord is split into several chapters. The formula works well enough, but having more interaction with the Lords of Shadows themselves would have been appreciated. The story feels like it's lacking a major antagonist up to the very last chapter of the base game. During this last chapter, there's a big antagonist reveal, only for them to be immediately one-upped by a bigger bad guy that comes out of nowhere. The DLC pushes this even further by creating an even more powerful villain just to push the stakes up higher than ever. During the travels through each of the Dark Lord's lands, you won't interact with them in any way until their boss fight. All three lords are well acted, and having them show up and torment Gabriel during his journey would have given me more motivation to take them down. Visually, the environments still hold up great today and are very diverse. One moment you'll be trekking through a bog, and just a few chapters later, Gabriel will be ascending through an intricate gothic castle. The first lord on Gabriel's hit list is Cornell, Lord of the Lycans. During the lead up to each lord, Gabriel may make a friend or two along the way, and on the path to fight Cornell, he befriends the mute Claudia and her sworn protector, the Black Knight. Claudia is the last of the Eghartians, an ancient race adept at crafting magical titans. Wandering through the Eghartians' land really gave me vibes of Majula from Dark Souls 2. Unfortunately for Claudia, Gabriel is unable to control his dark urges, and during one of his nightmares, he slays her. The Black Knight attempts to avenge her, only to fall to Gabriel as well. Gabriel really is a tortured soul. Anyone that's even a little friendly to him ends up murdered by his hands. With the Black Knight's magical gauntlet now in his possession, Gabriel advances to Cornell and faces the youngest of the Dark Lords. It's here where Gabriel learns that the Lord of Shadows are one and the same as the founders of the Brotherhood of Light. Each of the three members traveled across the world to sacred places where they transcended to aid God more directly. Ascension came at an unforeseen cost as the founders' spirits were ascended but split from their physical bodies, which remained on Earth. These physical forms embodied the darkest aspects of each founder and became the Lords of Shadow. At this point, Gabriel really only cares about resurrecting Marie and slays Cornell, who grants him the first piece of the unbelievably powerful artifact known as the God Mask. Refusing to let his nightmares get the best of him, Gabriel refuses to sleep from here on out and heads to the land of the vampires to reunite with Zobek. This is the longest stretch of the game and has Gabriel adventuring through towns and the Bernard Castle. Now inhabited by the vampiric lord Carmilla, Bernard Castle is the most interesting location in the game. Dracula's castle was always a staple in previous Castlevania games, so it was essential that Mercury's theme nailed the vampire castle in this incarnation. The lore behind the castle is particularly interesting. Prior to Carmilla's inhabitants, the Bernard family and Frankenstein occupied the castle. Here, Frankenstein ran sick experiments forming artificial life. Carmilla took advantage of this when she usurped control of the castle as she tortured Frankenstein into working for her. There's even more lore here related to the Brotherhood of Light, but that'll come later in the DLC discussion. Gabriel works closely with Zobek, making his way from the pits of the castle all the way to the top. Along the way, Gabriel unexpectedly befriends Carmilla's daughter, Laura. Having just watched Interview with the Vampire, Laura certainly reminds me of Claudia in that movie, both being spoiled vampire brats and doomed to eternal youth. Laura aids Gabriel in locating her mother and plays a larger role in the DLC, where she participates in the birth of Dracula. When Gabriel finally arrives in the throne room, Carmilla is waiting for him. She attempts to seduce him with promises of love and power, but cold-hearted Gabriel isn't open to negotiations and earns his place as a Belmont by slaying the Vampire Lord and adding another piece of the God Mask to his collection. With one Lord of Shadow left, Pan sends Gabriel through a portal to the land of the dead. These last chapters play out over a large span of desert filled with corpses. Unfortunately for Gabriel, Pan dons elegant armor and challenges him to a final test. Gabriel is able to maintain his kill streak on his friends and mortally wounds Pan during the fight. Believing this to be the will of God, Pan accepts his fate, and with the blood of the old gods spilled, the way deeper into the land of the dead opens. After a lot of puzzles, platforming challenges, and a fight with a massive undead dragon, Gabriel reaches the final piece of the God Mask. It's here where Zobek shows back up and finally reveals himself as the Lord of the Necromancers. He's the menace that's been manipulating Gabriel this whole time, causing him to murder his friends and wife. Zobek is also the source of the spell that severed Heaven's influence. With Gabriel delivering the God Mask to him, Zobek's long-held ambition to unite the Lords of Shadow power is about to be realized. It just so happens the Dark Gauntlet that Gabriel acquired in the early chapters of the game is Zobek's failsafe, as he uses it to cripple Gabriel, then kill him. It was clear from the chapter opening narrations and the several interactions with Zobek that he would be the game's final boss. Regrettably, this build-up is squandered, as the literal moment Zobek celebrates a victory, fucking Satan appears, and states he's been manipulating and giving power to Zobek all this time. This is just such an unrewarding reveal. The whole game has set up Zobek as this hidden nefarious force, and we don't even get to fight him. Yeah, Satan is higher up on the pantheon of bad guys, but maybe just keep him for the sequel instead. Satan immolates Zobek and claims the God Mask for himself before challenging his father, God. Meanwhile, somewhere between life and death, Marie comes to Gabriel and convinces the spirits to resurrect him so that he may face Satan. With a briefly renewed sense of faith, Gabriel shit-talks Satan's ambitions to become equal to or greater than God before the two begin the final fight of the base game. Empowered by the spirits that resurrected him, Gabriel bests Satan in combat. As he holds Satan in a chokehold, he asks God for forgiveness and opens himself to the light. With this power, Satan is sent back to hell, and the God Mask is left to Gabriel. The game doesn't give a lot of specific details on why the God Mask is so powerful, but Marie appears and states it allows one to see through God's own eyes. Gabriel is left unable to resurrect Marie, and the two give each other their final goodbyes as Marie takes the God Mask with her. With the connection to heaven restored, Marie, Claudia, and the other spirits that were trapped on Earth are finally able to leave the physical plane. It's here where the credits roll, but just after, we skip to some point in the future where Zobek is seeking out his old friend Gabriel. Unexpectedly, Gabriel has become Dracula, and Zobek warns him that Satan has begun to stir once again. The two have a brief scuffle that ends with Dracula throwing out the window of his hideout. He lands on a modern street where we discover centuries have passed since he fought Satan, but it's unclear when Gabriel became Dracula. Zobek once again convinces Gabriel to work with him, promising a release from immortality. This sequence sets up Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2, but to connect the dots on Gabriel becoming Dracula, 2 DLC add-ons were created for this entry. Lords of Shadow producer Dave Cox has gone on record stating, "We never planned to do DLC, so we ended up doing DLC after the fact, and in hindsight, that was a mistake. It was rushed. We had to rush it to market." There was almost certainly pressure from Konami to capitalize on Lords of Shadow sales figures, leading to a rapid follow-up with these add-ons. I'm glad the DLC focuses on Gabriel's resurrection as Dracula, but it does feel tacked on to the overall experience. The bonus chapters are included in the Steam and Ultimate versions of Lords of Shadow. The first add-on picks up right where the base game ends. Laura, Carmela's daughter, calls for Gabriel's aid as she's all alone and can feel a new threat rising. It just so happens the Bernard family that inhabited the castle before Carmela summoned an almighty demon called the Forgotten One, whose powers exceed even Satan. Long ago, the founding members of the Brotherhood were unable to slay the Forgotten One and opted to instead seal him in the plane of darkness beneath the castle. With few friends left in the world and nothing better to do, Gabriel comes to Laura's aid. This add-on also briefly allows us to play as Laura, whose mechanics aren't very fleshed out. The two manage to open a portal to the Dark Plane, however only dark beings can survive there. Laura offers her blood to Gabriel and implores him to free her from her eternal life. Seeing no alternative, Gabriel abandons his humanity and kills his only remaining ally in the world. Reborn as a vampire, Gabriel travels into the Dark Plane and fights the Forgotten One in 2 boss battles. During this time, the Forgotten One attempts to escape to the physical plane by using part of his power to break the seal that contains him. Just as the seal breaks, Gabriel jumps at the opportunity, seizing the bulk of the Forgotten One's power, which he uses to one-shot the demon. Now more powerful than ever, Gabriel crushes his combat cross as a symbol of his rebirth as a Prince of Darkness. The duality of man is the central theme of Castlevania Lords of Shadow. The game chronicles Gabriel's descent from one of the Brotherhood of Light's finest warriors into their sworn enemy. It's unfortunate that the Brotherhood, an organization sworn to combat darkness, ended up creating 4 of the worst evils humanity has ever seen. Gabriel's desire to bring back Marie led to his descent, while the founders' overwhelming desire to be closer to God created the 3 Dark Lords. None of these actions were inherently evil to begin with, but they had unforeseen consequences, causing massive damage that's hard to argue was worth it in the end. While Castlevania Lords of Shadow presents itself as a typical hack-and-slash game, it's also filled with puzzles and platforming segments. Combat generally feels tight, and as players make their way through the campaign, they'll unlock plenty of combat cross upgrades and new equipment. These unlocks expand Gabriel's fighting prowess, but they also allow him to interact with levels in new ways. This is where you can find some of the original Castlevania DNA, as you'll come across locked zones the game will blatantly tell you are off limits for now. Each piece of gear Gabriel acquires unlocks new abilities that can be executed. Some of these combos and abilities must be purchased first with experience points, like in Devil May Cry. I only replayed a few levels, but I was still able to purchase almost every combo and attack in the game. Beast riding is one system introduced by an upgrade early in the game. At first glance, this mechanic seems fun, but it grew tiresome quickly. There's a handful of monsters that you can mount, but they're primarily used to progress through the level. There aren't many opportunities to test the mounts out extensively in combat, and as Gabriel acquires more gear, there were fewer opportunities presented to mount beasts. Every time I saw a wall with vines on it, I knew I had to fight a warg soon so I could climb up the wall. I really just wish the game would have given me an item to do the same thing. Furthering its similarities to Devil May Cry, Lords of Shadow allows players to replay any level they've already completed. The level select screen makes it clear what items you may have missed. When you eventually gain the right tool to access locked areas, you'll usually find upgrades that increase the capacity of Gabriel's health, magic, or consumable items. Revisiting levels and getting access to their secrets is a good idea, but it's far less rewarding than the interconnected level design Metroidvanias are famous for. In Lords of Shadow, there are 4 consumable weapon items, and a surprisingly large number of enemy types. As you encounter enemies for the first time, they'll be logged in Gabriel's travel book. Checking these entries is important as they contain nice flavored text, but more importantly, the resistances each monster has to the consumable weapons. This can make all the difference in a fight, as some enemies may seem unbelievably tanky, only for them to crumple to 1 flask of holy water or a well-placed barrage of daggers. Knowing the right item to use against an enemy and when to use it can make all the difference in a combat encounter. If you run out of holy water, these coffin enemies are a headache to fight as they just take forever to kill. Furthering Gabriel's arsenal are light and dark magic, and they act as if you split Dante's Devil Trigger into 2 separate modes. For the unfamiliar, in Devil May Cry, Devil Trigger is a super mode that burns up the player's energy while healing them, making them hit harder, and giving them access to new abilities. Both of Gabriel's magics give access to unique combos and combat abilities, with light magic healing the player on successful attacks, and dark magic increasing overall damage output. A few bosses also have access to these magic systems, and invoking the opposite magic they're using is the only way to harm them. The magic system is one of my favorite mechanics in the game, and plays further into the theme of the duality of man. Each magical power has its own meter, but both are fueled by one resource called neutral essence. In every encounter, this forces players to decide which magic they need more. If you're shredding hordes of lesser enemies, converting the essence to dark magic could let you kill them quickly, but in difficult boss fights, I was often left wanting more health, leading me to convert the essence to light magic. Lords of Shadow lacks a style rating system, and combat greatly rewards avoiding incoming damage. There's not an explicit meter counting the number of hits Gabriel has racked up in a fight. Instead, there's a focus meter at the bottom of the screen. As Gabriel dishes out damage, his focus builds. Utilizing air combos and perfectly timed blocks fills this meter even more rapidly. While the focus meter is full, neutral essence will spawn when damaging enemies, but if the player takes damage or invokes either magic, the focus meter resets. With these systems working in tandem, it leads to tense and interesting fights, as you're encouraged to try and farm up as much essence as possible before picking the perfect time to burn it on magic. Boss fights provide some of the best moments in Lords of Shadow. During my fight with the first Dark Lord Cornell, I was converting all possible essence into light magic as he was almost dead and I barely had enough life left. While Cornell himself wasn't too difficult, I wasn't a big fan of the camera positioning here as it made some attacks hard to block and read. The camera isn't the worst I've ever seen. However, off-screen enemy attacks are always frustrating, and some form of targeting or highlighting would have made aiming ranged attacks feel much better. Although boss fights require the player to fight well, most have a gimmick tied to them. There's a few truly massive bosses whose fights clearly draw inspiration from Shadow of the Colossus. While combat is enjoyable, the flow of Lords of Shadow is often broken up by tutorials that force the player to slow down and read. I kinda hate this. The best tutorials are those that are crafted to flow nicely into gameplay and player experimentation. In Lords of Shadow, they're brick walls, and often completely take control away from the player. Tutorials or hints usually pop up as plain text at the top of the screen. Modern games have addressed this in a more elegant fashion, with characters talking to themselves or having companions feed you hints along the way. Further disrupting the consistency of combat encounters are the many puzzles and platforming areas. The puzzles vary in quality, but there's a wide variety of them. I've always liked puzzles where you line up beams of light, so those ones worked for me here, but I wasn't always a fan of what the game had to throw at me. There's even a full-on strategic chess-like game here that you can play in co-op, and it's pretty fun. Fortunately, if you find puzzles interrupting the flow of the game too much, you can always opt to skip them. The game provides solutions to every puzzle, but taking the easy route means missing out on the experience points puzzles would normally provide. The platforming is okay, with the standout platforming level being Chapter 9's music box. There was more than one moment where I grew frustrated with Gabriel's somewhat clumsy platforming abilities. I feel there's too many puzzles and platforming challenges in the game, and they're there to pad out the experience. Some of them are genuinely very fun to participate in, but I would have liked to see the bad ones dropped so the good ones could get even more focus. In the end, it took me around 19.5 hours to beat Castlevania Lords of Shadow Ultimate Edition, which also factors in revisiting several levels. This lines up pretty closely with the average listed on the playtime tracking website How Long to Beat. Here on Virtual Legacy, I like to rank games on my tier list at the end. This was my first time playing all the way through Castlevania Lords of Shadow, and I wanted to do so in the lead up to Castlevania Nocturne. If you have any interest in Castlevania from the anime, I definitely think you'd enjoy the story and gameplay featured here. There were some moments when I was beating my controller against the couch in frustration while I fought the Forgotten One, but most of the experience was enjoyable. My favorite aspects of the game are its well-designed combat, which provides players with tense encounters, and the overall lore and presentation of the story. Castlevania Lords of Shadow nearly earned a B, but ultimately, I'll be placing it on my C tier. If you want to check out another game with a protagonist caught between good and evil, featuring hack and slash gameplay, I'd recommend my video on Star Wars The Force Unleashed.